Hello everybody. So I'm talking about the Portico Library books, partly because I work here, but also I'm talking about a project that I've been doing that's been Arts Council funded as well, about my creative development. And in that time, I've been looking at the work and life of an artist called Mary Severn. She became Mary Newton, actually. And so I'm using her as a way in to explore some women in our collection that you might not know were here. And they're either women she met or were in her circle that she knew. And a couple of books at the end are women that she was reading and that she kind of talks about in her letters. But who's Mary Severn? That's Mary Severn. She did a self-portrait in 1862, which is in the National Portrait Gallery, but never on show there. It's currently in a display in Rome, on display on women artists, because she was actually born in Rome in 1831. And she was born to the artist Joseph Severn, who is better known for being with Keats when he died and then kind of keeping his memory alive and his poetry together. I also I've done a little close-up of her clutching her work. So in her self-portrait, and you really see it clearly in the exhibition in Rome, because she's amongst other female artists from the same period who are doing very similar kind of depictions of themselves with their work. And it's kind of like a change from previous self-portraits. And she's clutching a portfolio of her work there. So she was a professional artist. I'm going to talk a bit about her life as I go through, so I won't do it all now. But essentially, that's my kind of way into this. And this is just, well, you should have seen the head conservation volunteer when I was putting all these books out. We'll talk a bit about that later. But this is just a little bit. So if that's one woman and that's who she knew and who she read, and you extrapolate that out, there's probably lots more women in this collection that we don't know about.
Why did you pick Ann Mary Severn in the first place?
Well, because she was a professional artist, but she's not very well known. So if any of you have been to the Tate Britain We Are Here exhibition, she wasn't actually in that exhibition. But she was a professional artist, but she's usually overshadowed by her father, Joseph Severn, who, as I say, was Keats' friend, became consul in Rome, but also overshadowed by her husband, which actually cunningly leads me to this first book. Because if you searched Mary Newton in the collection, you probably wouldn't find her. Now, we can't pick this up because it's in pieces, you see. You probably wouldn't find her, but you would find her husband, Charles Thomas Newton, who was an archaeologist who worked at the British Museum. Then he went to the Ottoman Empire as a diplomat. And during that time, he excavated the mausoleum of Halicarnassus in Bodrum in Turkey. Now, they didn't meet till after that. And they met when she was drawing the sculptures at the British Museum, which was quite an unusual job for a woman to do and to have. But that's how they met. And this is the book he wrote about their travels, or the Travels and Discoveries it's called. And she did quite a lot of the artwork in this book, basically. So it's just signed M. Severn at the bottom, or M. Newton, I should say, at the bottom. And this is another problem with women in the past, because they often change their name. So trying to actually track them down is quite hard. So she was known as, Ann Mary, Mary Severn, Ann Mary Severn, usually Mary Severn, and then Mary Newton, or Mrs. Newton, or Mrs. C.T. Newton, or Mary Severn Newton. I tend to call her Mary Severn Newton just to kind of keep my mind clear. So it's quite tricky sometimes to track them down. And also I just found her fascinating as an artist, but also the fact that she was a professional artist who kept her entire family afloat, which I'll come to. The book at the back that some of you looked at earlier, which we can leave out when we have drinks because it is in a nice little case, is actually an example of her portraits, or her study of Mausolus and Artemisia. I think that's on the page of Artemisia, which is one of the colossal sculptures that you can still see today at the British Museum. And in the Greek and Roman department of the British Museum, they have a larger, like essentially the original that she did, which she'd made for his sketches, either side of as you go into the Greek and Roman department, basically. And I always used to describe it as, I mean, I've never worked at the British Museum, but I've gone in there to do research. I always describe it as a little bit of a love story as you enter the Greek and Roman department, because that's how they met in terms of husband and wife. that's the romantic in me. I do have some, believe it or not.
Say she is quite a bit of a romantic when it comes to
I pretend not to be. So that's the one in the back. And then this one here is, I was showing you this one partly because she made her reputation by doing portraiture. And so this is the only portrait that she has in these books. She mainly did portraits of women and children. But this one is I can never say, art mandrake Nicardrus, who was in a monastery in Rhodes. And although this book is set in the 1850s, it's actually based on a trip that they did in 1863, where she went with her husband and her friend Gertrude Jekyll, who was only 19 at the time, and that was the garden designer, became a garden designer, to basically 2 Rhodes for a holiday, but they went to Turkey, they went to Ephesus, they stopped at Corfu, they then went to Istanbul, and they went to Athens. And there's going to be an exhibition about that in May. Most of the women here actually did have to work for money. You know, they were, scribbling writers that needed to actually kind of, make funds, make ends meet. And Mary was no exception, basically. And she's hidden because M. Newton, you wouldn't know who she was. Most of her work is under her maiden name, basically. And because she mainly did portraits of women and children, most of it's in private collections. So, she did Queen Victoria's children, it's in the Royal Collection Trust. But unless you knew that it was there, you wouldn't really know that it's there, if you see what I mean. There were prints made of it, so you can trace it through to the National Portrait Gallery, who have the prints, but the actual originals are at Windsor in the archive there, which I've seen. And that she generally worked in watercolours and chalks until she married, and then she switched to oils. So that's why hidden in print. And actually, that's a good question for the next book, because this book doesn't even have the name on it. So it's in, as you can see, it's in pieces. It's actually a translation. It's in very bad condition. It's in translation of, it's called The Account of the, I'm saying this terribly, I need somebody Spanish to say this, I'm looking at Esther. The Account of the Apones and Equestrian People in Paraguay. So it's basically, I think it's a 15th century account. It's a translation, basically. Oh no, 18th century. And it's a translation made by somebody called Sarah Coleridge, basically. She was Sarah Taylor Coleridge's daughter. But her name is not on the frontispiece, because she promised her the kind of her uncle, Robert Southey, who was poet laureate at the time, and her mother, that she wouldn't put her name on the book. And she promised, to get it published. She was supposed to be writing it with her brother Derwent, but he lost interest, so she ended up doing it all herself. It's in 2 volumes. This is the first volume. Now, Sarah Coleridge herself has a really interesting career. She was estranged from her father because her mother and father split up when she was only about 4 or 5. But she lived in the Lake District with her uncle, Robert Southey, not far from the Wordsworth. So the family were quite entwined. But she was known to be brilliantly intelligent. She didn't have a normal education. And to be fair to Robert Southey, he lets her have the run of the library. They kind of had a belief that boys and girls could read the same things. They didn't have to go into one field or another. It's very much the romantics. And part of the reason I put Sarah Coleridge with Mary Severn is because, of course, that romantic connection. So they did know each other. They were on the circles of each other. Because Joseph Severn knew Wordsworth, he knew Southey. He was obviously more involved with the later romantics, like Mary Shelley. He did a portrait of Percy for her later on, and Byron. But he actually did know the earlier ones, because the late London poets came to visit Rome, and they always visited Joseph Severn. He was like the person who showed people around Rome in the 1830s. So, and Wordsworth was God's father to one of Mary's brothers as well. So there is this connection between them. But you would never know it was by her. Fortunately, our catalogue records it as being by her. So, I could find it. But if you look at the front page, that's why. And it's why, because she promised that she wouldn't publish it under her name, basically. But it did quite well in terms of reviews. As I say, it was a translation. She then, she did continue writing. And after her father's death, she kind of, with her husband, tried to reclaim his reputation, because Thomas de Quincey, who's also connected to the Portico Library, wrote a very critical review of her father and his work, and sort of said he was a plagiarist, all this sort of thing. And she was enraged by that, and helped her husband publish Table Talk of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which we also have. But she also wrote a lot of, she got into theology, she wrote poems that were published at the time, she wrote reviews, she's in that bit like Mary, I mean, she's sort of generation older than Mary Severn, but she was part of that movement from the Romantics to the early Victorians. So she kind of, as more things, you know, as basically more journals got published after the 1830s, so we have the repeal of the paper tax and things like that. So there's more journals, there's more newspapers, and that actually opens up opportunities for writers, and it also opens up opportunities for women writers, because there's more journals, there's more literacy actually for women, you know, middle class women are reading, and there's actually journals and things being produced for them. So actually for women, that is a change in terms of them being able to, you know, get professional gigs, if you like.
Yeah. When you say romantics as well, I know we all have our definition of romantics in that context.
Oh, in like in a literary context. Okay, so the Romantic poets, or that kind of movement, that's from the late 18th century, sort of 1790 through to about 1820s, 1830s, but they're still living, but the Victorians take over. And it's kind of important for this because there's a definite difference between how she behaves and how women's lives change in that period. Because on the one hand, they get more rights sort of later in the 19th century, and they have, but in the other hand, their behaviour is more closely guarded if you're middle class. Because to some extent you could be unchaperoned if you were a certain middle class, and the sort of like Mary Shelley, I mean, you know, she obviously eloped, so not many women did that. But, you know, there was a certain freedom actually, and the freedom got eroded actually during the 19th century, as some opportunities did open up for women though. So it's a kind of mixed bag. And then you have this idea, particularly in the Victorian period, of this kind of angel in the house ideal and the separate spheres for women. And this only applies, so this is not applying to working women who are in the factories in Manchester, no. It doesn't always even apply to the aristocrats actually, who would have political influence, but certainly to middle class women, there's this idea that women and men had separate but sort of overlapping roles, and the man was the one who was in the public and went out and earned the money, and the woman was the one who stayed at home but had work, but obviously it was unpaid work in the way that sort of census would gather it. So she had 2 children that lived to adulthood, and one was a daughter, I think also called Zara. Another confusing thing about the 19th century is they all name their children after their parents or themselves. So working out which one is which is sometimes quite confusing. But this was published about 20 years after her death. She died of breast cancer in the mid-1850s, I think. But she was still writing until, you know, all the way through. And she also writes about depression. She had mental health issues. Like her father, she became an opium addict and had to learn to wean herself off it. That was mainly because she was dealing with chronic pain. So she was a really interesting woman, and somebody I'd definitely like to have had dinner with, which is how I picture, as Carol Ann knows, I half live in the 19th century in my head. So it's a very interesting, and there is a really good biography of her and Dora Wordsworth, which again, if I would look it up on my iPad afterwards, if anybody's interested.
Interestingly, you mentioned 1870, and the synergy with the Portico Library is the fact that that's the same year that women were allowed to actually come.
Yeah, that'd be why. Yeah.
So it's just interesting that that's into our history.
So another woman who's, again, related in terms of to the Romantics and this kind of early 19th century, if you like, who, again, we know that Mary was reading, and we know that her father knew and is mentioned in her letters as being at parties, is Mary Cowden Clark. And this is a rather dry book, I have to say. It's the complete concordance to Shakespeare, but spelt in a different way to how we spell it today, because of course there wasn't universal spelling for Shakespeare until relatively recently. And this concordance, I mean, she wrote lots of things. She wrote novels, she wrote all kinds of things, but this was not bettered until the early 20th century, basically, this concordance. I'm just going to check the date of when it was actually published. 1829, she began it, and it was published in different parts in 1844 and 45, and it was actually mentioned in Punch, which didn't generally review works, but it became the go-to for anybody studying Shakespeare, basically. As I say, it's quite dry, it's tiny lettering and it's where everything's found. And she wasn't an academic. She wrote this, she was writing other stuff at the same time. We've got her signature there, but her name is at least on it. But she's Mrs. Cowden Clarke. And again, she was very well known in her own time. So she was in the circle of John Keats, the kind of 1810s, 1820s. And she knew Mary Lamb and Charles Lamb. She was a governess, and basically she saw it through the press, and it was in 18 monthly parts at first. So it wasn't a book at first, it was like a lot of 19th century texts, so like published in monthly installments, and then they'd be put in a book, maybe in volumes of a book, but then they'd be put in a book afterwards. And as I said, it was noticed in Punch, but according to the Oxford Dictionary National Biography, it wasn't superseded until 1894, and then not again until 1973. I'm not making a case that they're feminists as we might see them today, but there's definitely a sense of their own history and practice, I think, and positioning it a bit like Mary with her portrait, with her portfolio of work that she's holding, clutching to her as her identity.
Is there evidence that men would read the books by women to learn about women?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I mean, certainly as far as novels are concerned, they were mainly read by women, but this would have been read by men,
It's dry.
I'm not going to go down the stereotype, but yes, yeah, quite. I mean, there's definitely evidence that, I mean, like now that women will buy work whoever writes it, and men tend to buy work by men, and that was definitely the thing in the 19th century as well. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, so there is that. It is changing slowly, but there's definitely that evidence. But also just think about who is reading, who's reading periodicals. Caroline Norton, who probably is, of all the women here, is probably the one that you may have heard of. Because she was, I'm holding this because it's not in pieces, it's been rebound. She was a poet, an activist. She notoriously married really badly. She was from the Whig, sort of the liberal stroke Whig tradition. And I think her grandmother was involved in Sheridan and all that. And then she married a Tory, I think he was a member of Parliament actually, who treated her absolutely abominably. And she had no rights in terms of when they separated. The fact is, he had no money, so everything she had to write, to keep herself and actually at first her family before they separated. So she had to write for money. All the money went to him, even after they separated. And when they separated, he took her 2 boys, and she wasn't allowed to see them because under the law at that time, children were the father's property. Her mother had no rights, basically, to see her children, her own children. So she campaigned for that, from the 1830s, and it's because of her, really, and her campaigning and her journalism, and actually also her high connections, let's be honest, in high society and with politicians and things. She campaigned for the rights of the mother to have access to children. But even when she got that right, I don't want to be talking about her horrible husband, but essentially, he treated, one of the boys died, and she just didn't get there quite in time to see him, basically in an accident. But she then was very close to her son afterwards, her remaining son. But so she's one of the campaigners. She never saw herself as a feminist in that way, but she was somebody, that was one of the first laws that was changed in the 19th century. And we tend to think of the Victorians as repressive and, putting, this domestic spirit, this angel in the house spirit, but actually it's the Victorians that start to bring in legislation that protects women and gives them rights. So you don't get that in the Regency period. So, and I think that's partly why there is this backlash about the angel in the house. As women get rights, as we establish ourselves to be equal and have rights, there's often a backlash, and I think that's happening now, but it's kind of, exactly. So that's what we always have to prepare for. And I think that's what was going on in the 19th century. But Caroline Norton is a fascinating woman, and she also wrote songs. This book I pulled off the shelf, partly because it's got a beautiful illustration at the front that you can see. But it's also a book where she changes how she writes and what she writes about, because she mainly writes sort of songs. This is called A Child of the Island, and it's about the massive gap between the wealthy and the poor in the 19th century. And it's about, basically children. And it actually, somebody asked me earlier about Manchester connections. She doesn't come from Manchester, but she does base some of the stuff about factory conditions. Because obviously at the same time as she's pushing for mothers to have rights to children, there's a Child Factory Act going through.
1870.
Yeah, well, going up to that period, yeah. So the conditions keep changing. So it's quite a different type of book for her. It's because it's sort of a poem novel, if you like, about sort of social issues. And she wrote another one like this. But that's basically that's partly why I pulled that one out. But I also pulled it out because Mary Severn, getting back to her, went to a party, and let me just find you what she wrote. So at a party in 1851, Mary met Mrs. Norton, Caroline Sheridan Norton. And in 1840, as I say, she was part of the upper classes, and she was actually presented at court. Because of the relationship with her husband, she was a slightly dangerous person to know if you were an unmarried woman, believe it or not. That's how she was perceived. Anyway, Mary says, after going to this party, which will bring me on to my next books, Mrs. Norton was looking handsomer than ever. I tried to make myself look as smart as ever. Mrs. Norton alone was worth going thousands of miles to see. No one else I saw was more handsome. So basically she dressed to impress because she knew Caroline Norton was going to be there, who's obviously one of her heroines, and she reads all of her poetry. So there's a kind of, and she didn't know her well, but she knew her a bit, she knew her well enough to be at a party. And so her brother would often object. She often describes Walter kind of going, oh, do I have to take you to this party again and then pick you up at 2 a.m, because these parties went on a long time. They were...
I want to ask you. So, because I know you're married.
Yes.
So, it's even though the times, it was a class within a class. How could you go to parties and also work professionally?
Well, she often got her work by going to parties. So she was networking. Yeah. Yeah, especially for female artists who were doing portraiture, which was seen as an okay thing for women to do. So she was trained by a portrait artist called George Richmond, who was a friend of her father's, in 1849 to 51. And she picked up most of her work through women, actually, through society hostesses or women. And her mother was the illegitimate daughter of the Earl of Eglinton. So she had a way into aristocracy, but she wasn't recognised as part of the family, but they'd sometimes go and stay as the kind of lower relatives. So a lot of her, when she started to become a professional artist, from about 1853 onwards to about 57, she would stay with people and do their portraits, often their children or a young woman if she was about to get married, or just after she got married often. So these parties were about, sometimes they were about, some that she went to about networking for work. That one was more friends, because they were organised by somebody called the Bunsens, who's again, her dad knew in Reign, somebody called Christian Bunsen, who was a historian. There's a book here about Egypt's place in universal history. And he was a diplomat for Prussia and based in London about the same time as Joseph Severn and the family moved from Rome to London. The thing about, they knew everybody. They were one of these people in the 19th century who just knew everybody. They were connected to Niebuhr, who was a philosopher. They were connected to Prussian nobility, and so they're slightly connected to the royal family in that way. And essentially, they were very, very good friends to the Bunsens. They lived quite near them, but then as her father got less money, they had to move further out of the posh places in London. And I've actually done a tour of where she moved from. Basically, she kind of goes from sort of almost St James's Square area to like Pimlico. And thinking about what would have been there then, the big prison, Millbank, was in Pimlico. So that wasn't a great area to be moving towards, frankly. So Victoria Station wasn't there. The nearest station was Vauxhall. And she'd use the trains. She talks about getting trains and things. Her half uncle happens to be governor of Ireland, so that's quite useful. So when they go to Dublin, they can stay at Dublin Castle and that kind of thing. I know. And then introduced to, basically, she travels around Ireland doing portraits. That's really how she starts her career. When she comes back, in April 1853, and she's born in 1832, and she's 21 in June 1853, right? So the family have to try and keep it together until she's 21. The brothers moved out, another brother's about to emigrate to Australia. Fortunately, the oldest sister's married, so she's okay, and married to a lawyer and a cricketer. And so in June 1853, everything gets put into Mary Severn's name, because the debt collectors are hunting Joseph down. The bailiffs are hunting him down, and he's basically on the run. So he goes to stay in a shabby part of East London with his sister, who doesn't know what's going on. Then he escapes to Jersey, and the family are like literally scrubbing out his name in books and putting Mary's in instead, so they don't get taken by the bailiffs. But she knew so many people, and she helped her husband in his work, but was never credited in his actual work.
Has that got the thing in the people?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So in the beginning of the start of all of our books, these are who took it out. This is what makes our books unique to the library and to Manchester history, because it gives you the name of the member, or it gives you the number, I should say, of the member, and then the sort of date when they took it out. So you can see, I mean, some of them weren't taken out. I suspect this was reference only, but some of them weren't taken out very much. And then some of them, like this one, which is actually the life of Sarah Coleridge, is taken out quite a lot, which is interesting, which says something about her popularity and how well known she was.
I'm not complaining. Well, how come we've got all these books?
It's a good question. Well, we have a book committee. We're not a normal library though. So we're not a library like a university library. I'm just doing this up because I need to use this cushion again. We're not a library like a university library that would buy books for research or for teaching or for students to write essays from. We had and still have a book committee, and the book committee would decide what was bought. Sometimes they said things shouldn't be bought. Most of the time they said things should be bought. Yeah. So it would be very much probably what's reviewed.
And our book committee is basically one of the oldest, still one of the oldest ones. Of course, we were started in 1806, and book committee was more or less started at the same time for obvious reasons. So we have several committees now, but that is the oldest one.
So yes, Palliser. So I talked about Mary going to Ireland. And so she was best friends with another artist, actually, called Mary Palliser, who lived next door to them in this enormous... I don't know if any of you like Anthony Trollope, the novelist, but he wrote a series called The Pallisers. Yep. It was actually a TV show in the 1970s produced by Doctor Who. And
pointing at me because we're Doctor Who.
But the Pallisers was, as I say, a series of novels by Anthony Trollope, and he took the name from this family because there's millions of them, frankly. Finding out about them now is quite tricky, but there was a group, and they were all clustered around an explorer called Captain Palliser, who was in the military. And they were Anglo-Irish gentry, basically. They didn't have loads of money, but they had quite a lot of property in Ireland because it was a lot cheaper, obviously. And they were Protestant, so they had a certain status there that, obviously is pretty well known. Now, Trollope partly took that name because of the Anglo-Irish nature of the Pallisers, actually his parliamentary novels that he writes. But the other thing about them is that a lot of the women wrote. So one of them that we've got in the one, she was basically an arts historian. She married into the Palliser. You can see it's a really nice gilt book, and it's not on women to be writing about. It's on kind of war emblems and coats of arms and things like that. And there's lots of lovely illustrations in it. It's a bit bad condition, but you can see. This book, right, when I took it off the shelf, it was black.
Oh.
Right, literally black. And I remember them cleaning it going, oh, it's gold. And we were all like, oh, like Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
Precious.
Precious. Oh, look at that. So it was literally black. Yeah, yeah. So it was actually white first. You should have seen it. But you can see it's got lovely illustrations. She actually became a ceramicist. I mean, as in she wrote about the history of ceramics, mainly porcelain. And her work was still cited, and it informed the collections of the Kensington Museum, which becomes a V&A. And so, again, she has basically a lot of the collections that we still see today are there partly because of Mrs. Bury Palliser, who was Frances Bury Palliser, by the way. Look, it is, isn't it? But again, you wouldn't know. It's 1870, and again, her name's in it, but her first name isn't in it. So it's looking back to find the first name.
Timeline to George Eliot.
So this is 1870, Middlemarch is 1871, the first volume. And yeah, I mean, we have quite a lot of female artists in the I should say female art historians like Lady Eastlow, who was known as Elizabeth Rigby before she married. We have a lot of her work. The other book I'm going to talk about in a moment is, that's the one. She was also an art historian. And again, I think that's because art was seen as an okay subject for women to talk about, and it was, it was separate to why would men want to write about art? All that kind of stuff. It was kind of a nice little feminine thing that they could do, which is kind of ironic when you think about when you go into galleries and you just look at lots of naked bodies. Maybe that's just the art galleries I go to, but it's kind of like, but it's true though, isn't it? They're not particularly feminine topics, are they? So it's kind of, so it's kind of interesting that happens. But yes, so again, part of the reason, so she was part of that family, as I say, that Mary knew, and linked to her travels in Ireland. So this is Mary. She's 16 at this point. And she was a prolific reader. She loved romantic poetry. So she loved Keats, obviously, the connection with her father. Absolutely loved Keats. Loved Tennyson, Caroline Norton, Barrett Browning. She borrows books, and she sometimes describes, particularly when she's in Ireland, sneaking into the libraries where nobody else is. And it's like, because no one goes into the libraries, these Anglo-Irish kind of piles. So she actually sneaks into them and then sort of judges them by their book collection. It's quite interesting. Anyway, when she's 16 and she's staying with her wealthier, more aristocratic relatives, she says, I've been reading, she's actually quite bored though when she's there. So she says, I've been reading a great deal lately, for in my book, there is a history of the Roman war in Judea, which I read every day in my room. I've nearly gone through all of Mrs. Jameson's Greeks. Now, Mrs. Jameson was a historian, as I say, so this is later, that's 1848. So at that point, she'd published on the galleries. She'd published memoirs and essays, illustrative art literature, which is probably the one that Mary's reading, because that's where she writes a lot about pagan and sacred art, Greek art. And that's partly where Mary got her passion for Greek art, because she's soon after they're reading that book, she becomes a artist who's allowed to go into the British Museum galleries to draw from the antiquities. Another book that Mary was reading, which, and again, Mary herself seems to have been attracted to books about women, often by women. So again, when she's in Ireland, this is in 1853, and she's sneaking off into the library of Lord Monk, who's an MP, later he's Viceroy of Canada. So she says on the 7th of March 1853, she writes to her mother Eliza that there is nothing to do but read, because my boxes have not yet arrived. There's no one in the house but Lady Monk, the governess, and 3 children. So I spent all day by the fire reading. So she can't do any work because she's waiting for her sketchbooks and all her art equipment to arrive, basically. I would like you to read this book. It is an imitation of an old book and a modern one, Mary Powell, wife of Milton. I think it is quite a marvellous piece of writing, so exactly underlined, like nature underlined, that I could scarcely believe it to be fiction. So this book is called The Maiden and Married Life of Mary Powell, also afterwards known as Mistress Milton. So this is the first wife of John Milton, who is up there. It's because of this first marriage kind of breaking down, and then it gets back together again because the civil war happens. She's taken away by her family and not allowed to go back to her husband. And he writes treatises on why men should be able to divorce their wives easily because he can't get her back. So there's all this going on. Yeah, I know. That's right. But she's also written about Thomas More's daughter, as well as in the one who was beheaded by Henry VIII. And at the time, this was a bestseller, but it was also downplayed by many critics because they were like, "Oh, it's a historical novel. Nobody should be reading historical novels." The same thing today. Like women won't understand the difference between history and fiction. No, this is what they wrote, and she actually got quite a lot of criticism. Of course, that just made more people read it, And Mary obviously couldn't put it down. She really wanted her mother to read it so they could talk about it, basically. And I thought the other interesting thing, when I went to go and get it off the shelf, all the other books around it were beautifully bound. Look at that. So they'd all been rebound and redone, and this one, which was really popular, it's just literally coming to pieces in my hands. Fortunately, our collections manager doesn't mind me doing this because she describes herself as a field nurse in the battle for the welfare of the book. That's so Alice, isn't it? In the battle for looking after the books. But, it's a book that should be, I really enjoyed reading it, if I'm honest. I think it should be read. I didn't think it was particularly romantic or kind of, what it's been described as by some critics, but it doesn't make the canon, so, So that's the Mary Powell. Now I'm going to go to the tragic bit. Because, as I said, Mary Severn did marry eventually. She couldn't marry at first because, well, partly she had an incident at Eton where apparently a schoolboy got so overcome by her beauty that he kissed her, which caused quite a lot of consternation because, so she had to have her sister come and be with her so they wouldn't get carried away. So she didn't marry until she met, as I say, her husband, who became the curator of the Greek and Roman antiquities when she was drawing the mausoleum of Halicarnassus. So the person who employed her, he proposed to her at the end of 1859 before he was going to Rome to be consul of Rome. But she had to say no, even though she was in love with him, because she couldn't marry because she couldn't keep her family afloat. So if she married her husband, everything would go to him. All of her work would go to him, all the income would go to him, the house would have to be in his name, and it's whether he could support her and her family and potentially any children they might have. But legally it becomes very difficult, basically. So she had to say no. He came back in 1860 to give evidence of Parliament about the British Museum, and they proposed again, and she accepted because she's like, we'll work it out somehow. Basically, her mother said, we'll work it out somehow, but they didn't quite know how. But eventually what they did was they got Joseph Severn his job in Rome. So when he becomes keeper of the Greek and Roman department, and he's waiting for somebody to retire, and he writes to his boss, Panizzi, or the person who's going to be his boss, but his good friend, or Edward Hawking might stay until Satan drags him away, basically, who's this guy they're waiting for to retire. And he says, we have waited too long, because he can't, until he gets the job, he can't try and get his prospective father-in-law into his job, basically. So Joseph Severn becomes consul of Rome, despite being 16 years too old for the post, because you're not supposed to be over 50. But essentially, they pulled strings. They got Gladstone's right, they got Gibbs, the various artists right, various people to basically put their oar in, like John Ruskin and stuff, to basically get him the job as consul of Rome, so they could marry. Happy ever after, not quite. unfortunately. I mean, they did do good things in that 5 years of marriage almost. But unfortunately, she died of measles in January, 2nd January 1866, which she probably caught from a boy she was painting or drawing at the time, because I had measles. And of course, measles then was a deadly disease. So she does all these sketches, and he's lying on a sort of chaise longue saying, "Get me a book. I need it to be," what does he say? Books. Do find me an amusing book, right? And so she's looking for the bookcase for an amusing book. All she can find are really dry antiquity books. So that you've got that's the wrong one. So you've got Greece. There's Antiquities of Ionia, which we've got next door. There's Greek antiquities. She's reading them out, and they're all really dry archaeological works. And she's basically taking the mickey out of him, because she likes reading Dickens and she likes reading more popular novels and poetry, and he likes these. And even he is admitting that he doesn't just want to read dusty history books all the time. Which is something they used to argue about. So that's the end of that. What I'm going to do is pack the books away while our lovely volunteers open some Prosecco as no secco.